Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final session of the Edward Kremers Seminar on the history of pharmacy and drugs. As people start trickling in, I'll offer some introductory remarks for you. My name's Lucas Rickert. Very quickly, I am an associate prof in the UW-Madison School of Pharmacy. I'm also the historical director of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy, where the mission is to advance knowledge and understanding of the history of pharmacy and medicines. So I'm delighted that you can be here today. Last year, the Edward Kremers Seminar, what we are calling our Kreminar, was launched. And the idea behind it was pretty straightforward. During the pandemic, we wanted to help build some community for younger scholars and more established scholars alike. And we wanted to get them in conversation, share insights across time periods and disciplines, generate new ideas. We also wanted to take ideas around medicine and drugs and try and reach a wider audience besides just institutes and the academy. And so that, I think, is very important as well. So look, if you like what you see today, please spread the word around. Remember too that all the talks are recorded, so you can go back and listen 3, 4, 5, 10 times, as many times as you want. And if you're wondering why Edward Kremers, I'll just say like a couple things about him. He's the second dean of the School of Pharmacy here at UW. He was highly influential nationally in pushing humanistic approaches within the health sciences and in professional education. He helped redefine what the pharmacy degree actually is. He also co-founded the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy in 1941. So skip ahead 30 years to 1971. In a White House press conference on June 17th in 1971, the president, Richard Nixon, declared a war on drugs, and his message was pretty stark. It was America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. That's a direct quote. He announced that it was necessary to wage a new all-out offensive on this enemy, and his campaign would be worldwide in size and scope. So 50 years later, here we are. And the United States and indeed many other countries are reckoning with the fallout of that declaration. The impact of Nixon's pronouncement has taken many forms. The increased authority of federal drug control agencies, the increased rate of incarceration, the weaponization of drug laws to target people of color, and then, of course, the stigmas associated with various intoxicants. I guess I'd add, too, that harm reduction has at times been very much minimized at the expense of more punitive measures, leading the war on drugs actually to become a war on people who use drugs. And all these impacts have been felt across the globe, from the Philippines to Peru to Colombia to Mexico, from Afghanistan to Vietnam, as well as here in the States. So this year's seminar has been focused on opiates and opioids, and it's larger than it has been in the past. We're thankfully co-sponsored by the University of Kentucky's College of Arts and Sciences, and as well the Alcohol and Drug History Society. Claire Clark, who's here with us today, is the co-organizer of this seminar. Thanks, Claire, for sharing the duties this year, and thank you for just being you. It's great working with you, and I really appreciate your work. As well, Dr. Jonathan Jones, who's currently a postdoc at Penn State University, is here. He's been the moderator for these sessions, and it's been off the charts. We're extremely lucky to have him involved in the Kreminar this year. But okay, so let's turn to our wonderful proceedings today. This is the final session of this year's seminar. Like I said, our host and our interviewer today is Carolyn Acker, Professor Emerita of History at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research focuses on drug users, drug use, drug policy, and opioid pharmacology. And I'm not going to go through the long list of her publications. There are many, but I'll just say that in 1995, apart from publishing, she co-founded Prevention Point Pittsburgh, a needle exchange program that became one of the first programs in the country to distribute naloxone to participants for the reversal of opioid overdoses. And lastly, but most wonderfully, we're joined by Maia Szalavitz. Welcome very much. Her forthcoming book is called Undoing Drugs, The Untold Story of Harm Reduction and the Future of Addiction. It is really a first in a lot of different ways. I'm looking forward to hearing her discuss it. Maia is a big deal, and we're glad to have her here. She's written for numerous publications, from High Times to the New York Times, including Time and the Washington Post, as well as The Guardian, Vice, and the Scientific American, and the Atlantic, and other places. So she is the author or the co-author of 6 other books besides the one we're going to focus on today. And she's won a bunch of awards too, from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Drug Policy Alliance, the American Psychological Association, and the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. It really is a pleasure to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Maia and Caroline. And with that, I will be quiet and you two have the microphones. Thanks.
Great. Well, I'm Carolyn. And just one little note before I turn my attention to Maia. Nixon's war on drugs, it was not a sort of unexpected side effect that it became a war on Black people in American cities. It was built into the design. Nixon purposely, he saw urban unrest and addicted returning Vietnam veterans as serious political problems. And so he wanted to go after those. He wanted to tamp down the Black neighborhoods, and he came up with war on drugs as a campaign name to justify these kinds of incursions and violence. So that done. Let me just say what a pleasure it is to be here with you all today. Maia, his harm reduction could not have had a better historian than you. You are a superb journalist, and your book is a superb work of journalism. But as a professional historian, I can say that it is also a superb work of history and beautifully written, and so congratulations. You early on bring your own personal history with drug use into the story, and I think that was brave. It also, one effect can add to the sort of readability for a general reader to be drawn into the more theoretical parts of your discussion. But I wondered if you were also making an epistemological point, that we can't really understand drug use, its meanings, et cetera, if we don't include the lived, spoken experiences of drug users themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks so much for that wonderful introduction there. Yeah, I think it's really, really critical to, the nothing about us without us thing. It's absolutely essential, especially in this area where people are so marginalized and so stigmatized and literally still criminalized. Mm-hmm. There can be issues around that if people, for example, say, well, I recovered this way and therefore that's the one true way for everybody else, and my experience generalizes to everybody else. So in this area, unlike some of the other areas, there are some real cautions that one has to have around personal experience, because often people are taught to frame it in a particular way due to the treatment they've gone through, self-help groups, all kinds of, or just the general brainwashing of most of the media in this area. I was very glad that you mentioned that about Nixon and racism, because the thing that, you know, is visible throughout all of this stuff is that this is not about drugs. Because if we had a war on drugs, it would have to include alcohol, caffeine, Prozac. What we have is a war on certain drugs that is a fig leaf for the new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander so amazingly wrote about it. And right at the moment, I'm working on an article regarding that book and its influence, which I also discuss in mine. And it is, you know, it's quite astonishing how influential that has been, and that way of seeing and that way of understanding it, because it gave so much more compassion for the people who were incarcerated or were addicted in a way that previously hadn't been, because of, you know, just seeing it as a sin.
Right. Well, I wrote a piece after he died called Ron Johnson, My Hero, My Friend. Ron was, so this was when I was involved with Prevention Point Pittsburgh. Ron was an African-American man, grew up in the Black neighborhood, got into drugs, served time, came out, you know, got clean. And we at the Prevention Point Pittsburgh hired him to be a prevention case manager. That is, to work with our participants to help connect them to any services they might be interested in, whether it be housing, whether it be treatment, whatever. And he was just an amazing man. We had our Sunday site, and people would walk in, and practically every third person would say, oh, Ron, my man. You know, they'd known him on the street. One time we were at a board meeting with executives that were on a board of a charitable organization and were making a pitch for funds. And an African-American man is a board member, says, oh, Ron, hey, we went to high school together, he says. When we're leaving the meeting, Ron says, yeah, we went to high school together, and he was on the parole board that gave me my first parole. And so he had to be so proud to see Ron, you know, doing this.
Oh, wow.
So I forget, just that he brought, it was through him that I learned how important it was to understand multiple angles on this experience. So just changing the subject, as it happens, while reading Undoing Drugs, I have been reading Pharma by Gerald Posner, and as the subtitle, Greed, Lies, and the Poisoning of America suggests, it is a scathing attack on the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma and the deceptive marketing techniques and the resulting, you know, epidemic of overdose deaths that we are experiencing right now. So I highly recommend it as a book. It's long, it's detailed, but it's very, very good. And I don't know if you've read it. I suspect you likely have, Maia.
I have not actually read that yet, but I have to say that I am so tired of blaming the Sacklers for this. I think they're awful. I think pharma is evil and bad and wrong, and they did terribly deceptive marketing. However, since we cracked down on prescription opioids, we cut the opioid prescribing rate by 60% or more in the last 10 years. The overdose rate during that point doubled. So it got even higher than when prescriptions were increasing. Because what we did was, we did not reduce harm, we increased harm. We pushed people from safe medical supplies onto the street because these drugs are evil, so you can't have them anymore. And, addiction will just go away if we just cut everybody off. We spent all this money on prescription drug monitoring programs and all kinds of things to like crack down on patients. And the reality is 80% of people who misuse prescription opioids did not have a prescription for them when they started. In other words, they were as guilty as the Black crack users in the 80s. The white people are just as guilty, but we have to have this narrative about, evil pharma addicted innocent white patients. And so we can treat them nicely now because they were victims of evil pharma and they weren't really addicted the way those people are addicted. And I'm sorry, I'm fed up with that. I don't want to hear any more about the Sacklers. Like all of this, these legal cases have created this narrative such that my brother has a kidney stone and he can't get enough appropriate pain medication while he passes it. And we have to fight for that. And that's a mild case of, I've heard from people who they were on chronic opioids for 20 years, doing fine, could live a decent life, take care of their kids, all of this stuff. Now they're completely disabled and curled in a ball in bed because they can't get their medication, and their doctor, somebody's doctor dies, nobody's going to prescribe that dose to you, bye-bye. So I am a little tired of that, and that is why I do not read these books right now, because it would just make me too angry.
Thank you for that, Maya. That's an excellent corrective. And I'll tell you, Alice Bell is was with Prevention Point from early on, and she launched what was, I think, the second after the Chicago Recovery Alliance under Dan Bigg, to do naloxone distribution from our needle exchange site. And she and I, so the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, when suddenly overdose deaths were white people in the suburbs, we used to just have this joke about, oh dear, how sad, another blonde, blue-eyed, succumbed to overdose, rather sarcastically.
Yes.
So absolutely, I take your point. Now, changing the subject, some have concluded, I was trying to look on my bookshelves for this book because I read this book-length argument focused solely on making the case that the best way to treat opioid addiction is methadone maintenance. And I gather that you disagree with that, and I'd be interested in hearing your opinion fully on that.
Well, I want to say explicitly that we have two medications that cut the death rate from opioid addiction by 50% or more. Mm-hmm. They are methadone and buprenorphine. And in a climate where the supply is tainted with fentanyl and all kinds of other powerful synthetics, heck yeah, you should stay on methadone or buprenorphine, because you don't want to die. One slip and you just don't know these days. The supply is so tainted. And so while I think that it's really important to have multiple paths to recovery, when we're talking life or death, people need to be encouraged and honored and welcomed on these medications, and not be, you must show up every day, you have to go to this counselor who knows half as much as you do, or whatever it is. Like, we've got to have low threshold availability. You should be able to just go to a pharmacy and pick up your medication like everybody else does for their mental illness or physical illness or whatever they have. So what I'm not in favor of is our very punitive methadone system, but I'm absolutely in favor of the medication used appropriately for those who, who need it and want it, et cetera. I mean, I think that one of the crazy, ridiculous side effects of the DSM deciding to call addiction dependence is, now in the DSM-5, they've got rid of that and it's now opioid use disorder. But the ICD still calls opioid, it calls it dependence. And that's a real problem, because that means if I'm on methadone, I'm not in recovery, because I'm still dependent. And it means that if I'm on chronic pain medication with opioids, I'm addicted. So I should be taken off, because legally you're not allowed to prescribe for the comfort of an addict under that 1919 Supreme Court ruling. So yeah, I think there's so many ways that the situation is messed up, but we should get rid of all the jurisprudence that says that maintenance is not a legitimate purpose, and we need to get the cops completely out of regulating medicine at all, because having the DEA decide what drugs go under their purview is like the fox in the hen house, because they're going to want everything. And and they also, when they had control over the supply, which they did for the pharmaceutical supply, they just let it run. Like the massive increase in prescribing that happened couldn't have happened without the DEA continually increasing the quotas. And that's a thing they actually did have control over. Whereas, of course, they're not going to be able to stop the cartels or any of that other stuff. So why do we have them?
That's this kind of goes to a point you make, that that harm reduction meant that other kinds of intervention beside, and needle exchange was kind of the leading edge.
Yes.
But there are many ways of thinking about harm reduction, and that can be tried and studied, and that you need to weigh risks in context
Yes.
to evaluate the effectiveness of one or another intervention or outreach. So now I'm going to.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that to me, the beauty of harm reduction is that it looks at outcomes that matter. So, like, to me, harm reduction can be anything that you can prove reduces harm.
Right.
And so if you can prove that giving clean needles reduces the harm from HIV and bloodborne diseases, which by golly, totally amazingly does extremely well, then that counts as harm reduction. If you can't prove that, like, arresting people for possession does any good, and we know that it does a ton of harm, then that is not harm reduction. And so I think one of the things that harm reduction and why it has been perceived as such a threat to current drug policy is because if current policy were working, you wouldn't need harm reduction. It would already be reducing harm. And so framing policy as, like, we need to reduce the maximal harm is a kind of interesting gift from people who use drugs and people who were facing the AIDS epidemic to the rest of us who are now, like, having to deal with, like, oh, what do we do about COVID?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, here I want to change gears a little bit and tell a bit of a story of my own history with drugs. From 1979 to 1981, almost 82, I was director of a 3-person agency in Miami's Coconut Grove called Upfront Drug Information. So I was there, I guess, yeah, 79 to 8. It had been founded in 1973 by a friend from my college days who loved his drugs and was rich enough to have a family foundation that could provide initial funding for this organization. And the premise was, upfront drug information that people would get into, this was at a time of all the drug war myths and, one toke and you're dead and so forth, that people would get into less trouble with drugs if they had accurate information about them. And he was coming at this more from a libertarian than a social justice perspective, but nonetheless, he founded this agency. And so we had a phone-in line people could call with questions. We maintained a library that had the New England Journal and High Times. It had, the PDR and Goodman and Gilman and, books on acid and so forth. And also an anonymous drug analysis program where people could send in samples of a street drug and they would be analyzed for their content. And then people could phone in with their 5-digit made-up number and find out what was in it, quantitative, not qualitatively. And then we founded a magazine called Street Pharmacologist to publish the results. And I became editor. And as editor, I accepted my own submissions, and that's where my first published writing appeared, was in Street Pharmacologist. Now, there was a time when all of a sudden, there were these reports of overdose, some kind of overdose with 4 symptom patterns, all of which turned out to be, so everyone thought, oh my God, it's PCP. This is like 1979 to 80. PCP, the demon drug of the moment. No, it's this. Oh, no, it's that. Oh, no. No one could figure out what it was. Because, and meanwhile, the analysts who were analyzing drugs were not finding anything that could possibly explain it, doing qualitative research. Well, our lab, we had a very close connection with our lab analyst who also liked drugs, and we had street connections. And so we could put out the word, get a sample to us that is from that batch. And because we had the trust of the users, and then Lee, when he did the qualitative, diazepam, Valium, he then did a quantitative. Now, a typical dose of Valium is 5 to 10 milligrams. There were 250 to 300 milligrams in each pill, and every one of the 4 symptom patterns that were being reported are characteristic of Valium overdose. And so we solved that mystery. So important to have your connections with the street. All right.
Yeah, no, well, it's also really interesting because, as I've written this, I've heard about all these, like, sort of harm reduction interventions before the letter, before it had a name. And when I was deciding to write the book, obviously I had to figure out where I was going to start, and I was not going to start with Hippocrates. So I I needed much
Historian of medicine, I object.
I needed something much more narrow than that. And so I started with how the movement as a movement began in Liverpool.
Absolutely. And well chosen. And let me just say, I mean, the breadth and level of detail that you bring to this story, I mean, this is definitive. This is a definitive history of the emergence and establishment of harm reduction. So you mentioned Ed Kaplan's study in New Haven.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could say a little more about that. You know, that one of the tags that got attached to that study was "Let the needles do the talking." Can you explain the context for that and why it had to be the needles that did the talking?
Well, sure. And the single word answer is stigma. But the basically there was this whole nonsense about how people with addiction couldn't be trusted to report their behavior. And so they were going to lie for whatever reason because they just lie. Now, none of those people could ever explain why, if you give out condoms to people who use drugs and you ask them if they use them, they will say no. But if you give out clean needles, they will say yes. Why should they differentially lie on those things? No, they're telling the truth because clean needles make the high better. And for some people, condoms interfere. But yeah, like, so what that study did was look at like very, very tiny amounts of HIV residue in bleached needles that people had turned in. And so that was like objective hard science data. It wasn't just lying junkies. And so the politicians who had been very, very resistant were able to accept that study. There was another piece of it too, which was that the first Black mayor of New Haven, I don't think he funded it, but like he championed that study. Mm-hmm. And in New York, we had Mayor Dinkins, who's the first thing he did, the first Black mayor of New York, the first thing he did was, I'm shutting down this pilot needle exchange because this is evil and it sends the wrong message and all this stuff. So at that time, much of the Black leadership was seriously into the drug war and seriously opposed to needle exchange, seeing it as like, oh, you won't give us treatment, but you'll give us this.
Right.
Or it's just a form of genocide and you're going to put AIDS in the needles. And a lot of people actually believe that. And so there was a lot of resistance. Meanwhile, New York had 200,000 IV drug users. About half of them were already HIV positive. And we were just letting people infect each other. And almost all of the HIV positive babies were born to people who injected drugs, like something like 80%. Almost all the heterosexual cases came from people who used drugs, their partners, because mostly gay men are not sleeping with women. And so it was just like, there was no way to stop the epidemic if you didn't stop it in IV drug users. And even if you wanted to just let them die, they were going to be taking a lot of people down with them. So when they saw that, like, oh my God, like Edinburgh had this massive HIV outbreak because they did a needle crackdown. And then they spread the needles, they got everybody, and suddenly no more 50% infection rate, something like 5% infection rate. So we knew even like way back in the late 80s, early 90s that this would work, but it was just this political fight. And so, but when that study came out, and Daniels, I think was the Connecticut's mayor name. Anyway, when he came down in favor of it, he said, it is a Band-Aid, but it's a Band-Aid we need. Then Dinkins was able to move forward. And he'd also been, getting pressure from Matilda Krim and a lot of ACT UP people. But it was like and very shortly thereafter, the rest of the Black leadership followed.
Right. And it was just so important that the mayor of New Haven, the police chief of New Haven, they were all supportive. And Ed Kaplan, who was, drugs were not his field of research. He was in some kind of policy part of Yale, but he came up with this idea. They got the money to put a unique barcode on every single syringe that was handed out and then note was made of when and from which location that needle was handed out. And then if it was returned, that was noted. And so from that collection of needles, a sample was drawn and the blood residues were tested. And they found that over the course, I think, of about, well, several months, the rate of positivity in the blood residues in those needles came down by like 30%. I mean, it was just an immediate return on the investment of that research.
Yeah, no, and I mean, like, one of the whole sad things that we have to learn again and again via harm reduction is that people who use drugs are people. And if you give them an opportunity to be healthier, they will often take it, especially if you treat them with dignity and respect and don't say, you must do this, you must do that, you must quit drugs before we will talk to you because you're horrible scum. Well, yeah, that's going to be really effective in changing behavior. You know, but we have to keep relearning this lesson.
Yeah, and I once believed those things, and it took a process of education to figure out how wrong that was. Just a little anecdote: the first national conference that I went to that was about harm reduction was, you know, Dave Purchase set out his card table in the the late 80s, whenever it was, in Tacoma, handed out needles, and he helped found the North American Syringe Exchange Network, NASEN. And they, in 1996, held a national conference in San Diego, NASEC, the North American Syringe Exchange Conference. And at the opening plenary, Dave Purchase up at the, podium. and we were at these round, it was like breakfast sessions. So we were at these round tables, all these, and he says, look around the room. Look at how many of you are here. You are each out in your own cities, almost alone, doing this work. But look, you're not alone. Look at how many of us there are. And that was such a heartening message. All right, back to questions. Are you familiar with Carl Hart's research?
Yes, in fact, I worked on his first
your
book.
thoughts about it.
I'm sorry?
Your thoughts. Could you describe his research and tell us your thoughts about it?
Sure. So a lot of his scientific research revolves around experiments where they have people who are pretty committed crack users, and they let them sample some crack, and they ask them whether they would prefer $5 or another hit. And oftentimes they pick the $5. Which of course completely blows people's minds, because they think that people with addiction are completely enslaved to the drugs and nothing else will get to them, and they would always go for the crack, and maybe they're going to use the $5 to buy crack on the street. And I'm like, what? You have pure pharmaceutical crack and you're going to waste it on maybe getting ripped off on the street? That makes no sense. So anyway, but yeah, so that is his work in that area. And these days he is out about being a current heroin user. And he is wanting us to look beyond harm reduction into, pleasure and the right of people to do what they want with their bodies and this kind of thing. And I am totally in favor of the right of people to do what they want with their bodies. My feeling about that argument at this time is just that it's been so hard to get people to care about drug users at all, and to move to medical marijuana and move to recreational marijuana and all of this kind of thing, that I think when you frame it as it's my right to pleasure, people are going to say, what about the kids? And you're going to lose that argument. And so I feel like framing it as we need to reduce harm from the stuff that's already out there is more politically a strategically better argument. I don't disagree with him. I think I just disagree with just sort of some of the strategic ways of things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on that note, oh God, what was I going to say? Carl Hart's work. Oh gosh, I completely lost my thought. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Well, pleasure.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
And there's at least one scholar, I've got her book on my shelf, I don't remember her name, who very much makes the argument that pleasure is important, that this should be, and I more agree with you. And I do remember what my question was.
Yes.
Let's say, so we currently have legal drugs that are nonetheless a market that has some legal boundaries on it. So for example, underage cannot buy alcohol, et cetera, or theoretically consume alcohol, things like that. In Pennsylvania, where I lived for a long time, there were even more restrictive laws in some cases. So if you were the empress of the universe and you could create the ideal, assuming we're going to make all drugs legally available, what is the legal framework that you would create that in your view would maximize people's access to something they want to do while minimizing risks of harm?
So I think that is obviously the key question. And I think the answer, unfortunately, is that it's going to have to vary with substances and context.
Yeah.
For example, right now, we have probably millions of people using Kratom, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it is a very mild opioid-like drug. It relieves withdrawal from other opioids. It has some pain relieving properties, and it is very, very, very difficult to overdose on. Now, if there was a country that had no opioids, maybe that would be the one to introduce. But should we ban it now when people are using it as an alternative to fentanyl, which almost, so it all has to be in context. And I feel like one thing we really need to figure out how to have is kind of an FDA for recreational drugs. Because it's insane that like for all human history in the future, we're only allowed caffeine, nicotine, and alcohol, and probably marijuana now. And maybe some psychedelics. It's like, but there's no process. It all has to be medicalized if it is to find a way to be legally okay. And I think some things should be medicalized. I think we need to do a lot more sort of computer modeling about how markets for these substances work and what kind of substitution and complementarity there is in them. I'm perfectly comfortable with marijuana being commercially legal because I feel that, yes, market the heck out of it because it substitutes for alcohol and opioids to some extent. And, don't market those other things.
Right.
I still find it insane. And while we're in Purdue blaming mode, why was it legal for them to promote a controlled substance? Like, why? It's still legal. I could still make a new opioid and send my sales reps out with their little cheerleader outfits and free samples, and their quotas, like I need to get X number of doctors to prescribe.
Yeah.
Why was that ever legal? Like that makes
free.
that makes no sense. Exactly. And but again, like it's like I feel like part of the problem that we just don't look at with the whole prescription opioid issue is most of what the companies did was legal.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not ethical, it was not moral, but it was legal. And so suddenly turning around and like blaming them, it's kind of like, I feel like we need more blame on the regulators for that. But I do think that there is a way to find the sweet spot between commercialization and prohibition. Some things just shouldn't be commercialized. Like I don't really want Philip Morris fentanyl. We just need to find the way to minimize harm. And that's why I think harm reduction is such a powerful framework, because you can test empirically whether or not it does. And if it doesn't, move on to something different. And you need to be obviously careful because context is so important that you don't want to throw away something good from one bad study, but you really do need to account for local tastes. And one of the biggest issues in drugs is fashion, like something's trendy.
Yeah.
If we could predict what would be trendy, we could make a fortune in marketing other things. But you just can't, like fashion sometimes plays a role and it's hard to deal with. So sort of understanding how, how that works would be useful to dealing with trends. But I think also the critical thing to do in drug policy, aside from decriminalize everything right now, is to understand which drugs are riskier, understand the context that make them riskier, stop sending people to jail for possession. And there's one other thing. Oh yeah, just stop having the demon drug of the moment. Like, addiction is a thing. It will always be with us probably. You can switch it by fashion or by what happens to be available, from more harmful to less harmful substances. So how do we use that in our favor rather than doing stupid things like, oh, you have medical pain medication, that's bad, you shouldn't be on it. Now go buy some fentanyl on the street.
Right, yeah. Well, many years ago when I was teaching my drug use and drug policy class, we were talking about, what might legalization mean and so forth. And a couple of the students made the argument that if we're going to turn, say, simply marijuana sales into a legitimate business, that we should recruit dealers from the illicit market and train them to run the business, the illicit businesses. And my initial thought was, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. But in retrospect and over time, as my perspectives have broadened, A, they have a lot of expertise. B, the thing you most want to do if you're eliminating a source of livelihood for an entire population, you don't want to leave them, stranded. You want to create pathways. And one of the things I've learned in harm reduction, and again, my friend Ron Johnson is such an amazing example. I mean, he knew every treatment place in town. And so like I'm sitting at the table, hi, how are you today? I taking the little order, how many needles, which sizes, which kind, you need biohazard containers. Okay, take this slip over there, they'll bag it up for you, next. But this man sits down in front of me and I say, hi, how are you? And he said, I'm so tired of this life. Okay, well, what can we do for you today? Right. And here's Ron. And then of course I would never know what the outcome was of Ron, but Ron could get, when that person was at that moment of readiness for treatment, you connect him to Ron could get him into treatment that day at that moment of readiness. In Pittsburgh's Hill District, Black neighborhood where we did needle exchange on the edge, there was an older woman, Miss Edna Council, very respectable, upright, older African-American middle-class woman who, is walking past teenage girls in short skirts, hookers on the corner and drug users and this and that. But she would sometimes, when she encountered someone who seemed to be ready for treatment, she would escort them to the treatment place, just walk them past the temptations of the sellers along the way.
Right.
She was an amazing example. So I just learned so much. And one of the things I learned partly from Ron is the importance of paths back. You have to have, and harm reduction is partly about that. And also I learned this in part from sex workers. Sex workers, I forget her street name was Teresa Dulce. And she gave opening plenary remarks at at a NASEM conference in Seattle. And then she hosted a session, and she was involved with a group of sex workers that published a zine that had harm reduction information for sex workers and helped found this organization. And then I met sex workers, one who got a master's of public health degree, another who got a PhD in public health. Who is better qualified than these people who have worked the street and now have the education and can do the outreach? And at Carnegie Mellon, the state of Pennsylvania, this is what I was going to get at, the state of Pennsylvania was entertaining passing an act that would prohibit anyone from, we don't want drug users to have access to our children. So anyone who has any kind of a treatment record or criminal justice record cannot be a teacher, Excuse me, I said I was department head, so these are all the department heads across the university. I said, I know people who went from being sex workers to getting degrees. No one is better qualified to do outreach. Absolutely, they should be teaching in schools of public health and public health courses in colleges. And so anyway, enough of that.
No, well, I think it's one of the things that's really terrible about the way our current addiction treatment system is, aside from the fact that most of the treatment is horrible and abusive, is that because of different treatment ideologies, making those connections, getting somebody from harm reduction into treatment, or getting somebody from treatment into harm reduction if they aren't ready, those things don't happen as smoothly and as well as they should, because we're still hung up on the we need beds model.
Yeah. Although, I mean, there's the housing first model. Stuart Fisk, who was important with Prevention Point in Pittsburgh, and then went on to create a clinic at Allegheny General Hospital that was an outpatient clinic for men who were HIV positive, who were active drug users. He was a pioneer in extending treatment to people regardless of your level of drug use. And then has gone on to build a whole infrastructure in Allegheny County of very harm reduction kind of outreach and contact with people. And they had a thing called Housing First.
Yes.
Pittsburgh at that time, post-industrialization, collapse of industry, lots of kind of really cheap real estate. And so they, for 3 people, Stuart and 2 others, for something like $25,000, were able to buy a 12 apartment building in North Pittsburgh, in a kind of poor neighborhood in Pittsburgh. And they used 1 suite as an office. And this was modeled on a project that had started in California that Stuart was involved in.
Right, and there's like a whole housing first movement.
Exactly. And so if you had a history of homelessness, you could be an active drug user, and you were HIV positive, fine, we'll put you, you can be here, you can be. And at one point when I was getting ready to retire, I had this enormous credenza in my office that I was not gonna have room for in Berkeley. And so I donated it to this hotel. And at one dinner later, Stuart was saying to me, because this was something my father had specifically designed for our living room. And he said, I wonder what your dad would think if he knew it was now being used in a crack house. Anyway, so
I think John wants to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some fantastic questions from the audience, but I have a question, Maia, that I'm just dying to ask you. And Claire also put a similar question into the chat, and it's sort of a big picture question about the book specifically. And so the question is, from Claire, what most surprised you in the course of your research? And my question is sort of a related question. I wonder if you could walk us through sort of 1 or 2 of the big turning points that you recount in your book, in the history of harm reduction. What sort of 2 moments do kind of stand out to you in your mind as like the major milestones in the history that you tell?
So what surprised me was just how little people remember. Like I'm writing the first history of something, and I want to like not, ignore people who unfortunately have died before I could interview them. I'm looking at you, Dan Big, who I'm furious at for doing that. If interviewing people about people they know and trying to get stories of that other person's life is really hard. I know historians must have to do this all the time, but I'm not used to it as a journalist. I'm used to being able to talk to the source, or, people who are with the source recently. So just the difficulty of dealing with that. There was also like, so many people are just doing the action that there were very few records. And it was just a huge challenge because there were so many people, and like I shy away from calling it definitive because there's so much that I had to leave out. There's so many different people whose stories need to be told. I think there's many books about harm reduction, like in specific regions or communities that I just couldn't touch on. Like, I mentioned psychedelic harm reduction. I like left out Australia and everybody other than the UK, the United States, Canada, and the Netherlands. So, it's just like, in order, like Sarah Schulman just wrote a history of active New York, which is 700 pages long. and it's good. But I didn't want to do that because I felt like not that many people are going to pick up a 700-page book on something like this. So I wanted to just tell some stories, give people sort of a core idea of what, what this is and where it's going. And then hopefully inspire them to find out more and, talk to other people. In terms of turning points, like the founding of the harm reduction working group that eventually became the Harm Reduction Coalition and is now the National Harm Reduction Coalition. That was the first time harm reduction had a place to live in America that it could spread from. And it wasn't just a network of needle exchanges, it was beyond that. And so Dave Purchase and Stephanie Comer and Dan Bigg and George Clark, who founded that, really, deserve a lot of credit for bringing people together and getting these conferences going and making it known that this is an idea and a movement in the United States. The other, I guess I'm going to say three. So when Russell Newcomb in 1987 decided to write an article called High Time for Harm Reduction, that named the nascent movement within Liverpool. And then they developed their own journal. They had their own international conferences. And they, most critically, Alan Parry, who's one of the original Liverpool guys, ran into a social worker named Edith Springer on one of his visits to New York, and she was involved in early efforts at bleach distribution. And Edith Springer is the single most important person in terms of spreading harm reduction through the United States. If you ask the major people like Dan Bigg, just everybody knows Edith, and Edith converted a lot of them into believing that harm reduction was the way to go. And she did, thousands of trainings of different people. So it is rightfully that she is known as the goddess of harm reduction.
Well, I'm not sure if this is a turning point or a culminating point, but in October 18th, 1995 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, Desjardins et al. Maintaining Low HIV Seroprevalence. This was a meta-study of studies around the world examining where needle exchange had been implemented and what the impact was on HIV incidence, and gets down, 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 down. And ironically, in Thailand, a country which had done this very forward-looking outreach to sex workers, organizing them, sort of creating a norm that you could only have sex with a sex worker with a condom, and the sex workers unanimously said this is a condition. But they completely dropped the ball on needle exchange, did not do it at all. And in the rates, the HIV positive rates went from under 10% to 40% of the population in a short period because of the absence of needle exchange. And so no starker illustration of how critical it is. And as Desjardins et al. Argue, the time to start is when fewer than 10% of the population is already positive. And then you can, if you're doing adequate needle exchange, you can reliably keep it under 10% indefinitely.
No, I mean, it's like horrifying to see that I think Indiana and West Virginia right now are like cracking down on their needle exchanges. Like in Indiana, it literally went from they had 45 new HIV cases in a year in a really tiny county, 0. And they're like, oh, it worked, so we don't need to do it anymore. I mean, what? And similarly, West Virginia, they were warned by the CDC that you're going to have an outbreak if you close this needle exchange. They closed it. They had an outbreak. They still want to mess with it. It's just so crazy.
Yeah, I remember hearing in the news about the Indiana HIV outbreak and some of the measures that were taken to stop that. And that was actually one of the first moments that I became interested in the history of drugs and harm reduction. So for me, anytime that gets brought up, it brings back memories of just sort of getting my feet wet into the history that we're talking about today. So it seems like Maia and Caroline, sort of one of the takeaways here is that as far as turning points go, when the grassroots movement of harm reduction gets sort of institutionalized and formalized, whether it's scientific studies get brought in or whether it's through the creation of formal organizations to promote harm reduction, that's a pivotal moment, and that's when some substantial progress starts to get made. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that because there's always this sort of radical energy in harm reduction, and it's kind of like, there's a kind of resistance to the mainstream, but also a realization that, like, if you don't go mainstream, you can't have the kind of influence you want to have. But there's always that tension between the people, who want, complete legalization this second, and they have green hair and they want to, just like overthrow the world right now, and the people who are like, let's get some clean needles for the people that we can, and to do that we might have to take government funding, which means that we can't be like screaming on the streets as much as we are. And I mean, this is always a tension in activism in general. I mean, in ACT UP, you had a split between ACT UP and GMHC. GMHC was like gay men's health crisis. They were like, we're going to do service, and ACT UP's like, we're going to do direct action. And you really need both. Right. Needle exchange is this weird middle ground because when it's illegal, it is direct action, but it's also service provision. And so that was why sort of ACT UP originally did not want to do needle exchange, because they didn't want to be a service provider. And eventually the service providers, like the people who founded the needle exchanges in New York, founded their own nonprofits and it was no longer an ACT UP thing. And similarly, Housing Works, which was one of the first housing first places, they started in ACT UP, but they realized that they needed to provide housing for their people because nobody else would. And so they founded a nonprofit, which is now very successful in New York. It's kind of a New York icon now. So there is always that tension there. But I think turning points in terms of harm reduction becoming expected, I mean, this year, beginning of COVID, suddenly we have all these op-eds like, oh my God, we have to do harm reduction because people are not going to give up socializing entirely. And, there was a couple of, gay men made this up. Well, they were gay men who were drug users as well as drug users who were not gay men. But, it was like, it was very interesting to see suddenly how mainstream it was. Also, if you just Google any of the job search places, there are now thousands of jobs in harm reduction, some of them at government agencies. In the past, the United States literally went around to UN agencies trying to stomp out the term because they didn't want it to spread. And so, and now we have the Biden administration putting harm reduction as one of its top priorities. Whether they will actually do that is another question, but.
Yeah, and so speaking of the tension between the sort of the grassroots approach to harm reduction and kind of that top-down approach, we have a couple of questions from the audience about sort of supply side policies, policies that might help contribute to harm reduction or maybe get in the way of harm reduction. And for me, this is one of the things that I'm really struggling to wrap my head around too. So I'd love to hear any insight that you could share into this, both from the history that you tell in the book and also from your perspective on the future of harm reduction too. So you mentioned that earlier in the talk that opioid prescriptions have decreased by 60%, but that overdose deaths haven't correspondingly decreased. They've actually skyrocketed. Right. And so that kind of raises the question, I think, for David Herzberg, how can we meaningfully curb bad corporate behavior that has contributed to the opioid crisis, but do so in ways that actually reduce overdose deaths? Like, how can we implement?
I have an answer to that, which is very, very, very obvious and would have been very easy to do. You close a pill mill. You have a list of every single person who's getting drugs from that pill mill because they need to give their license, their real name, to get the prescription from the pharmacy because it's a controlled substance. You immediately offer those people a medical evaluation. Do you have pain? Do you have addiction? Do you have both? If addiction, instant buprenorphine or methadone. If pain, appropriate treatment with a new doctor. If they had done that right at the start, instead of like, oh, we'll identify these people and throw them out, they would have not created the heroin market that was created by simply throwing thousands to millions of people off of opioids without doing anything for them. I mean, it sounds seriously obvious, but they thought, I don't know what they thought. Like, I just wrote a piece about this for Scientific American because it was so annoying to me. It's like, why isn't there a program that law enforcement has? We're going to go in and shut down this doctor. We're going to make sure that the patients have other doctors that aren't going to say, well, the last guy you prescribed to got arrested, so I'm not seeing you. And make sure there's immediate access to prescribing of buprenorphine and methadone in a way that is low threshold enough that most people will accept it. It's so stupid. But the belief seems to have been, well, we just got to do this because it's bad, instead of being like, oh, we could actually maintain these people until we can find other things to do for them. Well, of course, that has legal issues, but we could have dealt with those legal issues if everybody wasn't on this big crusade, opioids evil.
Right, right. And I mean, it speaks to some of the sort of long-standing, like century-long anti-maintenance policies that kind of date back to the 1920s morphine maintenance clinics too. So there's a really long history here. And if it sounds like what you're saying is if we had, put some concerted energy into changing gears, that it really could have made a difference early on in the opioid crisis.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's just common sense. And it's so
right.
like, I really feel like these people do not believe, they must believe that addiction is a sin and that if you just take away the drugs, it will be cured.
And one of the historical influence here is that, in the 19th century, physicians, 2 years of listening to lectures and you had an MD until the reform of medical education in the last decades of the 19th century. And B, these physicians were prescribing morphine just like mad. And so you had these enormous, lots and lots of people addicted to morphine. And in reforming itself, the medical profession came to recognize that they were kind of characterized as pill pushers in a sense. And so they really clamped down on restricting the prescription of opioids to distance themselves from this bad image. And that was partly got built into the laws and helps explain the reluctance to manage pain effectively over the course of the 20th century.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, like way back to like Troy Duster, who points out, the sociologist who pointed out that, at that time was when medicine abandoned heroin users. They just abandoned everybody with addiction in order to make themselves look more respectable. Also, I think there was like sort of another medical abandonment of people with addiction around alcohol, because again, it seemed like nothing works. And so then they just let AA do it. And so it created, we have like kind of three healthcare systems. We've got like physical healthcare, we've got mental healthcare, and then we've got addiction. Now, all of those should be integrated. It's not like you're a person without a body if you have an addiction. It's not like about half of us don't have another mental illness. But the siloed nature of treatment for these things that has allowed all of these completely harmful and non-evidence-based policies to grow is a big reason we need to do harm reduction. I mean, one of the things I noticed in talking to a lot of people within harm reduction is that lots of us, including me, have personal experience of knowing that treatment was going to be, we're going to confront you, we're going to humiliate you, we're going to attack you, we're going to break you down. Who wants that? Like, why wouldn't that make me want to use drugs? Like, I am a person who's scared of socializing. Like, you're going to have people yelling at me in a group, like that's going to fix me? Like, how does that possibly fix me? So the tough love thing, like harm reduction is sort of, in some sense, a reaction against it. And it also like disproves all of the claims like you must hit bottom first, or if you don't treat them badly, you are enabling and that their addiction will never end. Well, gee, we give out free prescription heroin in Switzerland, and you know what? Those people get into abstinence recovery as much as anybody else. So it's like, it's just really, yeah.
Yeah, and I think this raises a related question that actually Luke just put in the chat a few moments ago, and it's about pharmacists. How can pharmacists step in and help contribute to harm reduction? Do you think, Maia and Caroline, that pharmacists have a role to play here? Pharmacists and pharmacy leaders, I should say.
So let me start with this. Stop denying people opioid prescriptions. Stop denying people who are clearly in pain and like are gray and like, you know, have a kidney stone. Like, stop it. It's not a fake prescription. And even if it is, who cares? Like, at least they're not using fentanyl. This whole business that you should be policing doctors prescribing, and that it is a good thing to turn someone away, gotta go. Like, I mean, pharmacists should not be cops. And yes, I realize that there are legal issues around this, but I have heard from so many people who've had so many extremely stigmatizing experiences with pharmacists, including people with like serious chronic illnesses who are told you're a junkie, you know, and oh my God, don't get me started on sickle cell. It's just like, because then you add the racism to it and it's even worse. I mean, I talked to a guy with sickle cell who, he was having a stroke and they thought he was overdosing. Like, strokes are common in sickle cell. Like, if the guy can't talk and he says he has, you know, and his wife is saying this guy has sickle cell, this is not an overdose. Like, Narcan him if you want, but like scan his brain too if you know, it's just like, I mean, can you imagine the experience of basically being about to die of a stroke and not being heard because they think you're a drug addict? I think one of the things that really needs to be done is to recognize that like people with addiction and people in pain, nobody should be in a pariah category in medicine. Everybody should be treated with dignity and respect, even if somebody's trying to, you know, scam you for a prescription. 99% of the time, that's not what's going on. But when that is what's going on, just like telling them to fuck off, excuse me, is not going to solve anybody's problem. I mean, I guess it solves your problem, but you know, pharmacists should be able to dispense buprenorphine if they think somebody is addicted and faking. And you know, the patient should, you know, you have to believe the patient. Like, yes, there are jerks and people who are going to lie all over the place, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that if they tell the truth, they're not going to be helped. So make it such that, you know, if somebody comes into a pharmacy with an iffy prescription, you call the doctor and don't just say, oh, this doesn't look right to us, or, oh, this person has a high NARCS care score, so we better send them away. Like, it's just, and I mean, I know that the pharmacies, like the doctors, are being judged on the number of pills. And this has got to go. Like, this is not, you know, if you compare like a oncologist prescribing patterns of the opioids to a GP, like, yeah, Mr. Oncologist is going to be like #1 prescriber. Also, #1 prescriber is going to exist always because math. So if you keep taking them out, it's not going to, I mean, I know I sound exasperated, but it's an exasperating situation. And if you were to watch my Twitter feed and see all the horrible cries of agony from people in pain who are like, you know, there's millions of people on chronic opioids who are currently either being tapered or forced to stop and becoming disabled as a result, and nobody will listen to them. Like, I try to pitch these articles, nobody wants them. All they want to hear is addiction and the Sacklers.
Incidentally, a marvelous book on the history of sickle cell is Keith Waylu's book, Dying in the City of Blues. It's really a good book.
I'll check it out.
Seconded, yeah, it's fantastic. Anything by him is like great stuff. So I have a lot of questions, but I think I'll ask one that bounces off of something that you just said a moment ago, Maya, and also something that Caroline had mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and it's about race and racism. So Caroline, you mentioned that Nixon's drug war at the beginning, 50 years ago, specifically targeted Black heroin users, and so my question is a follow-up to that. For you, Maya, how has sort of the racist policing of drug users that stemmed from Nixon's drug war in the 70s until now, how has that affected the progress of the harm reduction movement, or the course of the harm reduction movement?
Well, I mean, this is what's really just takes the cake on racism. But there were a lot of us who were fighting for syringe exchange and kinder evidence-based policies to deal with people with addiction, like not locking them in jail and saying that'll fix them. So there were those of us saying this in the 80s when everybody else was like, war on drugs, war on drugs. But nobody would listen to us. And then suddenly, oh my God, white people are getting addicted to opioids. Now we have to be nice. So the harm reduction movement was itself kind of suppressed by racism. And there was also the case that there were people certainly within the harm reduction movement who weren't as conscious as they should be on race. And there was like a lot of kind of clueless white people that didn't make the movement a comfortable place for many Black people. And then there was also the Black church, which until Michelle Alexander's book comes out, was really, they weren't necessarily in favor of the war on drugs, but they saw drugs as a sin for the most part. And they did not want to do anything that could be perceived as supporting that. So they continued to support the war on drugs, even though it was leading to mass incarceration. But when New Jim Crow comes out, it gets passed from hand to hand and meeting to meeting in throughout the Black church in a kind of amazingly viral way. And people are suddenly like, wait a minute, this isn't fixing drugs. This is about oppressing us. Mm-hmm. And once you have the Black community seeing that, the white liberals can't be saying, oh no, we need this war on drugs, because they're now being called racist for doing that, rightly so. But so that really creates this enormous change within the left on the drug war, because the way it had been framed in the past gave cover to the racism, and when you rip that cover off, it's revealed, and then the sort of real media drumbeat on the opioid thing happened around the same time as that book is, New Jim Crow is starting to get currency, and you started getting it's my kid, I want them to be saved with naloxone. I don't want them in jail. Oh, this is a health problem. So it kind of, if anybody had any doubts about whether Michelle Alexander's point was correct, all they had to do was look at the response to the opioid crisis compared to crack. Mm-hmm. And there's a very, very, very obvious difference there, and it ain't subtle. So did I answer the question? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that, it reminds me of something that I just read in the news a couple of days ago, and it's that the journal, I think it was the chief editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, just stepped down over a controversy related to a podcast that basically denied that there was systemic racism in medicine. And this, the distinctions between the government response to the crack epidemic and the response to the opioid crisis, which was for so long framed as a white crisis, a crisis of white prescription drug users, just reminds me so much of bigger conversations that are happening in medicine about structural racism. Right. And so it's just interesting how many connections there are between the harm reduction movement and the trajectory of medicine in 21st century America. Just an observation there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was so great to see was Black Lives Matter embraces harm reduction, and explicitly in its legislation, the Movement for Black Lives has called for abolishing the DEA, decriminalizing all drugs, and expanding harm reduction options. So I feel like there is this whole, and I mean, if you just look at the absolutely hideous George Floyd case, while that guy was dying, while that guy was being murdered, the other cop was standing there pointing at him saying, "This is why you don't do drugs, kids." Like, if that's not a clear example of the racism and of the way drugs are used to hide racism, I couldn't give you one. And the fact that, they just went after the, his lawyers and his defenders were, saying, "Oh, well, this guy was on drugs, so he should have died." Like, and the Black community is just not having that anymore. I mean, it's like, it was really beautiful to see that, the stigma that is so attached to people who use drugs for so many racist reasons is starting to be abandoned in light of this awful thing.
So I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and ask you about your research process, Maia. I think as we wind down the talk, I'd love to know, as somebody who's writing my own first book, and I think a lot of the audience members are also are historians who are also actively writing books. Could you share any writing advice for us? Your books are your books and also your articles are so fantastically well done. Could you give any tidbits of how to successfully write about drugs in a way that humanizes drug users and also tells a bigger story that gets at sort of the structural issues here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, boy, was this a hard book to write, because I had been, I'd been involved in the early harm reduction days in New York. I wrote about the needle exchange trial that began to get it legalized for The Voice in the 90s. And I know these people, at least on the East Coast, I know most of the people. And in the UK, I know a lot of the people. So it's always nerve-wracking to do that. And somebody's always going to hate you for it. And so I'm just that was so anxiety provoking for so long. And I'm still anxious about who is going to attack me for something that I really didn't know was even a problem. But, it's kind of inevitable when you're writing about a movement of really kind of prickly people who've had very difficult lives. And, that's just writing about activism, basically. But so I warn against that in some ways, but I felt like it just needed to be done. And none of the other people who said they were going to do it did it. So I needed to do it. In terms of how to do it, I think it's really important to stay mentally organized. This was such a huge logistical organizational nightmare. I used a program called Kreminar, which allows you to it sucks all your research into it, and you can then search throughout. You can have interviews in it. You could have magazine articles. You could have videos, which I never figured out how to do, but I didn't need to. You can have web pages. It just everything goes in there, so that it's not you have to be okay, which website did I save this on? Which piece of paper is this lurking on somewhere? Obviously, I guess you could drag books into it, but I didn't try that. But it made it a heck of a lot easier to keep track of an enormous amount of research. I did about 200 interviews, and I could have done 500 more if I had the time. I don't know how many books or articles I read, but not a small number. So being able to deal with the cognitive load of all of that was important. Keeping your subject narrow enough. I had to decide, much as I'd love to really get into psychedelic harm reduction, I just can't. Much as I would like to include the Australians, I can't. Much as I'd like to include more people in Philly or more people in Atlanta or et cetera. Nope, it's just not going to work. And people you like are going to get cut out and they're going to be mad at you and you just have to deal. So, that was totally the biggest challenge of this one. Like the other ones, Unbroken Brain was interesting in the sense that, it's partially a memoir and partially an argument that addiction is a learning disorder. I thought, oh, this is going to be easy because I don't have to interview anybody. Like, it's just like my story and the science that I know. And like, the problem was that like my story is emotional to me and I had to like deal with that stuff that I wasn't expecting. Like, and just, I don't know. I'm just trying to think, like, it's hard for me to talk about process because so much of it I just do and I don't think about. But if you have more specific questions, I can probably answer them.
I've heard a few folks talk about Scrivener lately, and it seems like something I need to jump on board. It seems like it could be really useful. And so I do have one specific question, and then another question from the audience. You mentioned that because of the huge volume of like interviews that you did, that some folks had to be cut out of the book, or that's something that can happen when you're dealing with such a big like volume of interviews of living people. Luckily for me, I'm writing a 19th century history of drugs, and so I'm working with folks who can't be mad at me anymore. But how is that the potential for folks being angry at you, like, or any kind of backlash from your sources? Has that affected the book that you've written? I don't know. I guess what I'm asking is, how do you balance that? Like, how do you tell an unflinching story while also balancing the feelings of your sources?
Yeah, I mean, that's always hard. I just try to be as accurate as possible and not be a jerk. There's like people who will be like, they'll report stuff and it's stuff that could damage somebody and they don't care because it's like, yay, I got this material. I am not like that. If it's going to damage somebody, I'm probably going to leave it out unless it's critical to the story. Because I don't feel like having a better, background story or something like that destroys an organization that I'm writing about is like useful. So, other journalists may see it differently, but because this is a movement that I personally care about, I want to, not like get people in trouble. And I feel like under an environment of criminalization, there's stuff that like you can't include without harming people, and they're just going to have to deal. I am planning on putting up an archive of the transcripts of the interviews, but that's going to take a little time because I will have to, there's scurrilous gossip that really needs to get cut out of it, basically, that can go up after people die. But I have to give them the chance to, to look at that and not, slander people and stuff like that. If I was going to do a book on the sex lives of harm reductionists, oh my God, I don't want to do that book. It's like, it was a hard thing because I actually had an ex-boyfriend in Liverpool who I had to write about, and I had to put a disclosure. And that was awkward, but it was fun.
Yeah. And I think, you mentioned that putting the transcripts up. I would love to read those, so I can't wait to see those personally. But also I know that the field, the history of drugs is going to benefit so much from being able to access the raw material and your analysis of the raw material too. So that seems really cool to me. I can't wait to see both the book and the transcripts. I want
to just say to Carolyn, like she was going to be doing a needle exchange history, and I sent her some of my archives from that time, and she sent them back to me beautifully organized when I needed them. So I just want to say thanks again for that.
You're welcome. I'm glad. I mean, I'm a slow writer, and I'm glad you brought yours out in a timely way.
And I'm going to try to like put the whole archive somewhere. It's just a matter of dealing with it.
So there's a question from the audience from David Courtwright for both Caroline and Maia. And the question is sort of a big picture question about how to balance the commercialization of drugs, like the unfettered commercialization of addictive drugs, with total prohibition. Is there a sweet spot that both of you think that we can reach between like balancing, like sort of completely banning all drugs or allowing all like Sackler type actors to just sell whatever they want, however they want? How do we hit that? David calls it a Camelot spot or a sweet spot.
I mean, yeah, I think it would really have to do with a specific substance. Like I was saying before about marijuana, I think commercialization is probably fine for marijuana because it's not that harmful a drug. It's not non-harmful, but it is, you can't overdose on it. It does not have the extreme harms that are associated with, you know, the physical damage, et cetera, associated with some of the other substances. But when you have something like cocaine, that to me is like the ultimate regulatory challenge. You know, some people say, oh, well, you know, you could just make coca tea, but that's not what the business executives on Wall Street are going to be doing. They're sipping their little tea. So I think it's different for every substance. I think we have big data enough that we could be able to look at what variables matter and come up with ways to find that sweet spot. There may be some instances where you're trading harms that are going to be different. People's value systems are going to be different about. And so that is not a matter of like science. It's kind of a moral judgment that people are going to have to make over, say, you know, if like, you know, 3 more people die of liver disease during this policy, but 10 more people get like, you know, extreme joy, like, you know, I mean, I'm just making these up, but the trying to do it is a difficult task, but we definitely know that extremes are bad, that prohibition is bad, and that commercialization is bad. I mean, of the two, I prefer commercialization simply because we're not putting people in jail. And I think that putting people in jail and stigmatizing them does enormous amounts of harm. But I'm not a huge fan of hypercapitalism. So I would like to have, I would like limits. I would like, you know, the question then becomes also like, how much of a nanny should the state be? Like, you know, are we going to tax sugar because it's bad for you? What about the pleasure people get from it? This is where I very much agree that pleasure matters. Like, and I think it was Ingrid's book, that Ingrid Walker, that focused a bit on that. But I think like not counting pleasure in the balance is a problem. On the other hand, focusing too much on pleasure when the people with addiction, not drug use, but addiction, that is almost always more about self-medication of things than it is about pleasure, and framing it as being about pleasure makes them look selfish and evil and bad. So I try to avoid that framing, but for recreational use, which is a term I really need to figure out an alternative to, but for recreational use, pleasure matters. And there was a really weird analysis that was done of smoking once, where they actually counted the pleasure of smoking in favor of it. I don't think it was done by the tobacco companies, but you know, anyway, but this is stuff that we need to do and understand and could be really rich areas for research. And I think, you know, for now, in terms of drug policy, we're going the right way. Legalize marijuana, decriminalize possession of everything, and work from there to see what's next.
And I would just add, see to it that there is absolutely accurate information widely available so people can inform themselves. Again, back to the upfront drug information mission of give people the information so that then can make a decision based on facts and research and the combination of their own desires.
Yeah, and I think in just, you know, in general, in you know, the time of COVID, facts and information provided up front to folks is something that we need more of. So I'm glad that you mentioned this, Caroline. Well, we're starting to run out of time, but I just want to reiterate for Maia and Caroline that this has been a fantastic conversation. What a great way to top off our 6-part Kreminar series. And I cannot wait, Maia, to get my hands on a copy of this book. I hope pre-orders are off the charts. And with that, I'll pivot to Lucas, who will close us out.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you. It's great. I'll just re-up what Jonathan said. Buy Maia's book if you can afford it. I don't think you'll be sorry about that. And thanks to all of the participants as well who have taken the time to be here and listen and ask questions. Remember to visit the AIHP YouTube channel if you missed some of the other sessions and want to catch up. And besides that, I just hope you have a great summer and please take care.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.